afternoon on the last day of the conference, which means that either Deb Quazzo hates all of us, which is possible, or that she really loves social impact because she's convinced that this panel is going to be what keeps you here. So we're going with the latter. We're going with the latter definition.
She rejects the social impact label herself.
There you go. Well, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. So you're in for a treat. It was well worth your time to stay. To my left are some of the most exciting and dynamic folks in the education sector and education technology, and a terrific continuum of social impact investors. I'm John Rogers. I'm the partner leading the education sector for TPG's RISE Fund. And as a starting round, without doing a lot of introductions about ourselves, it's generally important when you talk about social impact investing to define what you mean by investing and social impact. So maybe we'll just go down the row, starting to my left, Amy Klement, who leads the education sector work for Omidyar. Before we talk about social impact, what is Omidyar's investment strategy in the education sector?
Yeah, so it's great to be with all of you. And it's nice to see so many people interested in the impact. So we at Omidyar Network, so we're founded and funded by Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, and his wife Pam. And we've deployed about over 150 million in education across India, Africa, Latin America, and the United States. And our strategy is really unabashedly impact first. So we're very focused on where we can support entrepreneurs who are unleashing human potential around the globe. And we look at places where we think that there's potential for massive disruption. So in emerging markets, we look at innovative school models, we look at ed tech across K-12 and workforce and skilling. And in the US, we have a deep focus on early childhood with the two-generation lens. And I should note that when we look at impact, we look across the spectrum from for-profit to nonprofit. When we first started, we started as a foundation, and Pierre sort of reflected on, well, eBay created 1 million jobs and was funded by pure venture capital. So this was back in 2004. So he's really one of the original impact investors. And so then became Omidyar Network. We invest about 50-50 for-profit, nonprofit, where you actually don't care about the legal entity, about the form. What we care about is it's scalable, sustainable, and having significant impact. And we'll probably talk more about how we define impact later.
So I think that gives Amy a really neat perspective because she can do grants, she can do equity, she can do loans. Vivian, how do you approach investing?
Yeah, so the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative was founded by Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan. And really what we have as our mission is to build a better future for everyone across 3 specific initiatives at this time: education, science, and what we call justice and opportunity. And the approach that we're taking is to say, instead of maybe traditional forms of philanthropy, I think taking a page from Omidyar's book, we really want to use a variety of tools. And the 4 tools in our toolkit specifically are impact investing, which we're here to talk about, grant making, as you'd imagine from a foundation, policy and advocacy work, and then also engineering, largely in support of quality solutions in order to help them scale, and oftentimes in partnership with nonprofits. So in terms of how we think about what we're trying to do on the impact investing side, really what we look for is for the opportunities where venture is uniquely suited to create scale and sustainability, where there is an opportunity to build a business. And we really look for companies that we think can be completely transformative and innovative across a number of different areas, whether it's distribution or business model or pedagogy. And we look for entrepreneurs who are going to really be able to toe that line in terms of really being focused on a vision that really will improve outcomes in terms of learning and employability, as well as access and equity. But that at the same time know that they're building a business, and in order to be able to scale to reach tons and tons of users and to really impact learners, it's really going to be important to be able to attract talent, attract funding, and to execute well. So that's the approach that we're taking from an investing perspective.
Matt, how about you? How does ReThink define its investment strategy?
We have just one little tool, venture investing. We, 10 years ago, started a venture capital fund. We started it because we thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in venture. We thought that there was a huge opportunity in invest in companies that help people to achieve their full human potential as workers, but also as citizens and family members. We invest at every stage from seed through to growth. We are agnostic about ownership, and we invest at every stage of the human life cycle from pre-K through workforce training and lifelong learning.
Tory, how about Al? How do you define your investment strategy?
Tough acts to follow. So we're a venture capital fund, right? And we see a massive sector underinvestment in education. We think it's a tremendous opportunity. We measure the social impact of our investments on a deal-by-deal basis, and we don't do that for any reason other. Well, I'll back up. We do that to stay very, very close to the efficacy of the products, right? We want to understand what is working best. Companies that are operating in this space are selling product to people who are buying that product because they expect some sort of lift in life outcome or student learning acceleration. And so to the extent you take your eye off of social impact while you're investing in this sector, you're getting away from the value proposition that these companies are delivering. So we are very traditional in that sense.
So now let's segue to how we define social impact. And Amy, you have described previously an interesting kind of algorithm, the way you think about impact, breadth times depth equals impact. Describe more about, say more about that, and how do you think of? Oh, I missed it.
Breadth, we actually talk about breadth times
depth,
depth
and influence.
times influence equals impact.
This is why I need practice.
I know, we've done this before. So when we talk about breadth, we look at lives touched. And then when we talk about depth, we look at the depth to which those lives are touched. And that's a lot harder to do. And as we look at that, we also look at how underserved that segment is, low income or another sort of underserved segment, special education, et cetera. And then there on depth, we use high, medium, low. And to be honest, it's been somewhat subjective by our team. We sort of have defined what those categories look like, but it's somewhat subjective. One of the things that we've done recently is we've run Acumen has a lean data product that goes out and actually reaches out to customers to understand customer performance and customer feedback and behavior. And one of the things we found through that surveying 5,000 customers of our portfolio was actually we were right. Our subjective analysis on high, medium, low really matched with what customers were saying, the depths to which their lives had been changed through these products, which was great. So depth, breadth, and then we also look at influence. So we look at how is that organization being catalytic in the market? So are they influencing policy? Are there copycats in the market? Are they being replicated around the world? And so we look at that sort of entire equation to get to the impact of an organization.
Is this included in your underwriting, in your investment memos? How is this discussed when you're underwriting an investment opportunity?
Yeah, so we have those discussions. We also talk about, like in depth, we talk about that influence, sort of like how are they being catalytic? And we've got a bunch of different vectors in which we look at that. Is this a new model in a new market? Is it an old model in a new market? Sort of how are they transforming? How are they interacting with government and policy and that sort of thing? And then we have targets for those, and we come back and we circle back on in our regular portfolio reviews. So we actually are renaming our portfolio reviews to be impact reviews, so that we're really making sure that we're focused on not just the financial performance of the company, but that the overall architecture is looking at impact at the highest level.
Vivian, how about you? How do you all define social impact?
Yeah, I think for us, ultimately, since we have very clear mission and objectives, in each of our different initiatives, it's ultimately not going to be success if we just build a really great venture portfolio and an exciting venture portfolio. I think it's absolutely important to have companies that are successful and interesting and transformative, but ultimately we want them to be driving towards a kind of future that we really want to be creating. So I think, to your point, John, a lot of it does get underwritten in the beginning because ultimately that's when you have the most influence and the most strongest ability to discern whether the entrepreneur is aligned with you. And so we do look very heavily at whether or not the entrepreneur is trying to drive towards a vision for education where we really are building a future where what works wins, for example, and that we are measuring what works. We are also looking for entrepreneurs that might not begin with a model that is truly affordable, but there is a very clear mechanism and method towards getting to that, whether it's through scale and by starting with a product that even the highest income users would pay for, or whether it's a model like Bridge International, where it's architected from the start to be replicable very easily in low-income and emerging countries, so emerging markets. So I think from that standpoint, that's very important to us. We also look for companies that ultimately are very innovative, like I said earlier, around either distribution or business model or pedagogy. And I think something that we also look for is the company actually transformative in the sense that they're unblocking something that was previously preventing progress in the direction that we cared about. So as an example, with one of our companies, Andela, these are students, these are computer science developers in Africa who would never be able to afford a world-class fellowship for 4 years, but instead with Andela, they actually get paid to learn to become world-class developers. We have a company called Byju's that when internet data was expensive in India, what they did was they actually had a mobile app, but they also had an encrypted SD card so that the students could access the content offline and still be able to learn but not consume tons of internet data. So these are the kinds of things that actually we do look for, because ultimately what we have found, at least with our entrepreneurs, is the ones that are really aligned towards the kind of efficacy and outcomes and access that we care about usually are thinking about a lot of different ways to incorporate these types of things, whether it's inclusion and diversity and equity in their model just across the board. And I think the other thing that I would say is we do look for entrepreneurs who approach the problem very much from a research-based perspective. So they're developing the product from the start with a mindset towards what is the research-backed approaches that should work. And they're also approaching it from a very iterative perspective. Our learning science team calls it a learning engineering approach. But it's also a team that really does care about measuring and iterating based on whether or not it works. And so a lot of what we end up doing during the life of the investment is also to make sure that we are helping them along that process through the work that we're doing, through the program work and the grants work that we're doing in learning science, for example, through our whole child work. And it's very important for us that we're supporting the entrepreneurs to continue to building their products in the direction that we think will hopefully serve kids better.
One of the stories that I like about ReThink Education is that when they first, this maybe, you correct me if this is apocryphal, but that you had 2 fundraising decks, one that had a page talking about social impact and one that didn't. Is ReThink a social impact fund, and how do you, Matt, define social impact?
Well, we were doing social impact investing well before it had a name. In my partner Rick's case, he started a real estate fund that built medical office buildings. He made his first EdTech investment in 2000. I made mine in 2003. We tried that fundraising strategy and pretty swiftly realized that we weren't getting any money from anyone who didn't care about social impact, no matter what we said. So we might as well be authentic. It was within education. I think that if you're not thinking very seriously about social impact and all of your stakeholders, you're actually writing a put on your investment. It will catch up to you sooner or later, possibly outside of your investment horizon, but sometimes a company goes out of business in this sector because it wasn't thinking about all of the stakeholders. We like what we call authentic entrepreneurs who don't just decide that it looked really cool in the social network when Mark Zuckerberg was becoming a billionaire while still wearing a hoodie, but rather they want to solve a particular problem, not to become an entrepreneur. A lot of them, we and everyone else have mixed feelings about first-time entrepreneurs, but there's something to be said for a guy like, say, Jeff Scheuer of ReThink, who is a Chicago school teacher, who observed that the students didn't even bother to read the comments that he made on their papers, and they never learned a single bit of grammar from his corrections. And so he started developing an online resource to teach bits and pieces of grammar and punctuation to them. And then he shared it with some other teachers. There was a lot of enthusiasm. It kind of went viral. And then he decided to start a company, right? He didn't know he was starting a company. He knew that he had a problem, and he would have been happy to take a product from someone else, but there wasn't one. And he tried to get other people to solve it, and they wouldn't. Now, the authentic entrepreneur has a couple of advantages for you as an investor. In impact terms, that entrepreneur has what what Paul Brest, for example, calls additionality, which is kind of an ugly word, but the idea is that you're doing a job that would not otherwise get done. And you described this, Vivian. Unleashing some sort of motion that had been blocked. But from an investing standpoint, that is what finance people call alpha, right? Because you're going somewhere that other people aren't going. But these entrepreneurs also have a couple of other interesting characteristics from an investing standpoint. One is just that because they have a strong social mission and something they believe in, they have an advantage in recruiting. And recruiting the best talent is one of the crucial determinants of success for a technology startup. And if you take two startups that are otherwise equal, even two startups in the education sector, and one really wants to change the world and lift up the vulnerable, and the other one is making money on something like, no offense to anyone here in this business, but say lead generation, which is more about the needs of the college than the needs of the student. The millennials, the best talent, the ones who have the skills that everyone wants, are going to move towards, they will take a significant pay cut to move to the company with a superior social mission. And then there are a couple of other factors too, like the truly authentic entrepreneur is a little bit less likely to cheat you. And I'm not talking necessarily about illegal things, but when there's an acquisition, sometimes the entrepreneur can cut a separate deal for herself than for other employees or investors. So someone who is about the mission is not going to, is less likely to cheat you, is also less likely to quit. And it's really hard to be an entrepreneur. It's surprising how often they just give up. Sometimes they sell the company prematurely, sometimes they just quit and go somewhere else. They decide there's an easier path to the hoodie and the billionaire status. Whereas the person who created the company to solve a problem that he desperately wants to solve isn't going to go anywhere else because nobody else would do it in the right way.
Tory, you were responsible for helping to found a fund called Catamount. You were leading education investing. That was, I think, the most successful part of that fund. You built a good relationship with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then founded OWL specifically to focus on the education sector. Are you an impact fund? And within education, how do you define impact or quality?
Yeah, no, I love the question, and yes and no. So here's what I say, like, I don't think you can be successful building ed tech companies without having like a very, very, very sharp lens on impact. Defined many different ways, but the core problem, we're saying a lot of the same things in different ways. Like the core problem these companies are trying to solve, and if they solve it successfully, they will become big and successful, revolves around advancing students, whether those are professional learners, higher ed, K-12 learners. So, you know, to me, they're one and the same. Like, you can't build big, successful companies in this space without being seriously close to the metrics around social impact. There are issues identifying as a social impact investor in the venture capital space. Let's just call them out. There's several of them. One, it's very hard to raise a venture capital fund with that as your explicit mission. People infer that your returns will be inferior, and therefore you maybe qualify for the impact pool of their foundation, which is $3 or $4 million, not the core bulk of the foundation, which would be $3 or $4 billion, right? So it's very difficult to scale a fund with that label. Secondly, it's very difficult for your companies to raise downstream capital if other new investors who are not impact investors, who are just looking to grow assets but are important constituents of a deal, view you as not values aligned with them. So if I'm a growth stage investor and I'm looking to invest in a company and I hope to take it public someday, and I see that like, oh boy, everyone else on this cap table is an impact investor, are we going to be values aligned? Are we going to be working in the same direction? There is danger to being too proactively labeled as impact. It can hamper a company's growth. So I'm just putting reality on the table. So, I think for us that are investing in this space, we have impact as our core objective. It's tied fundamentally to the success of these businesses, but there's sort of an interesting dance around being proactively labeled impact.
I should probably spend just a minute mentioning how the RISE Fund looks at impact. So when we're looking at investments, we're trying to find those business models in those companies where we believe that the opportunity to drive social impact at scale is collinear with the opportunity for financial return because of the demand that impact creates. Our impact underwriting methodology includes developing a social impact valuation model side by side with the financial model. It may be helpful to you. I think when we have these panels, it's great when the panelists talk about specific companies and also talk about specific resources. So there is a Harvard Business Review article about our IMM methodology if folks want to take a look at that. But I think the other panelists have mentioned part of what this kind of methodology helps you to do is really grapple with the evidence so that you know that the interventions, the services provided by the company are impactful, do lead to high quality educational outcomes, and that you really put that value proposition for the consumer front and center. Omidyar is another group that's terrific about publishing reports and data and explanations, and you mentioned kind of lean data before. I think you've been working, Amy, on some reports around 10 years of investing in education, and also I know that you're working on lean data. So can you just tell us tell the folks here what resources there might be and to learn more about your impact underwriting?
Yeah, so two things, because you mentioned reports. Back in that corner, we just launched two different reports. One is on trends in early childhood in the U.S., which was Michael Moe's #1 trend and opportunity, if you went to his plenary. And then the second one is on how ed tech ecosystems have been built around the world, and sort of what are the what's needed. And we did deep dive case studies in Chile, Indonesia, China, and the U.S. So
that's what they call a no-look pass. I didn't even know those reports were there.
So I chatted a little bit about lean data, which is really, we just did this recently, and it was really eye-opening for us. We did it for all of our portfolio. We had about 75% of our portfolio opt-in, and we just got terrific data straight from the customers, which is an investor you don't always have. It's usually sort of via the company. And what it also did was really it opened up space for great conversations with the companies. And as I said, it really validated our subjective evaluation of the depth to which the lives were touched. The other thing that I would just say as far as how we measure impact is, while we are definitely impact first, we also recognize that these are we often invest early stage. We can't put too much, can't saddle our entrepreneurs with too much impact evaluation. And so we use, we've really leveraged, coming out of the UK, if you Google Nesta evaluation framework, it's a framework that has 5 stages of impact evaluation. Starting with stage 1 is, can you articulate basically your theory of change and sort of the research that backs sort of the logic behind why you think this is impactful? Going up to, can you demonstrate that there's impact on your customers, to can you demonstrate that there's causality, all the way up to sort of RCT and the gold standard in evaluation, coupled with do you have the systems and processes to replicate it? And so we track where our organizations along that NESTA framework, and ideally are helping push them to the next level, including sometimes using grant funding to help our organizations fund evaluation studies. So that's really important to us, that we're like really helping ground them in efficacy.
Maybe to add some specifics on top of that, because as practitioners, providers, entrepreneurs, cost is a real issue. So I should transparently say that our IMM underwriting methodology is expensive for us. We have lots of consultants, we spend lots of time on it. We're probably putting 6 figures of investment into every impact underwriting. So that is, you can only spend that amount of money on the impact underwriting if you're investing in larger deals. So the lean data is kind of interesting. How much do you think you as an investor or impact entrepreneurs have to spend, in underwriting the impact in an earlier stage investment?
Not a lot. In an early stage, and I mean, I think it comes back to what Tory and Matt were saying, and really when you were talking about sort of the alignment of the entrepreneur, I mean, that's where we invest our time and energy, is really understanding the motivation and the values alignment with the entrepreneur, and why are they doing this? What do they care about? And so at that early stage, there's not as much to really test and define. We do make sure that it's research. It's really based in the science of learning and what we know works.
Yeah. Vivian, how about you? I mean, we always want to hear from the entrepreneurs. What are you measuring? What are the levers that really drive impact? What do you ask for in your reporting, in your dashboards? How does management report to you on impact?
Yeah, so we don't have, unlike a lot of traditional foundations, we don't have a specific dashboard that would say on a regular basis we need to report on X, Y, Z. Because I think for the same reason as a few people have mentioned, one of the things we don't want to do is especially at early stages in company formation, we want to really allow them to really kind of build towards that. It really is at the beginning very much a mindset. But I think for our companies, honestly, it kind of varies. Like I think we like Matt, invest from early childhood all the way to workforce and skills development through K-12 through post-secondary. We invest across the globe, both in the U.S. as well as in emerging markets. We invest B2C, B2B, B2G, B2B2C. So from that perspective, a lot of these companies are just going to come back with very different types of metrics. So a lot of what we do with our companies does end up being in some ways responsive to what is it that their model is actually enabling and empowering, right? It could be, in the case of Bridge, the fact that because it's so affordable at $70 per year per student for an entire year of basic education, they have 50% women or 50% girls in their schools, right, in Africa. But it could be something completely different. I think for our companies, I would say there's a few companies like Bridge, like New Zealand, like Age of Learning, that are kind of best in class in terms of having a tremendous number of learning scientists, learning engineers, curriculum writers, a lot of focus on doing these randomized control studies. But then there's others who are direct to consumer, where they're a little bit more focused on some of the metrics that they need to measure that fortunately also drive business success, right, which is engagement and renewals, customer satisfaction, et cetera. So we do actually balance it in terms of what the different models are, just to make sure. But ultimately, over time, we probably are nudging a little bit more than maybe the traditional financial investor, actually definitely more than the traditional financial investor would be, in terms of making sure that the companies are continuing to focus on iterating and making sure that they're always thoughtful about, again, access and affordability, for example, as well as continuing to iterate the product.
I want to make sure that we get to a couple of case studies so people hear real-world examples. There was a company that announced earlier this week that they were sold for a breathtaking, stupefying, unbelievably high number. And
Too
that
soon.
two of the panelists here were investors in Trilogy that sold for a whopping $750 million. Is Dan Summer in the audience by any chance? I think he's in a jacuzzi right now that's filled up with $100 bills. Matt, tell people a little bit about, so Matt and Vivian, I think, were both investors in Trilogy. So they may be going home to a jacuzzi of $100 bills as well. But how did...
We're using it to inspire other companies.
That too. How did Trilogy think about social impact, and did that help the growth and valuation of the company?
Could I reframe that a little bit and
Sure.
talk about our approach to technology skills in general? So we invested in General Assembly, which Jake once somewhat whimsically called the technical college for the Ivy League. We decided when we were looking at its impact on the wallets of the students that it was sort of a substitute for an MBA. Somewhat arbitrary way of getting at that question, but a useful one because the numbers turned out to be quite staggering. So Trilogy mostly runs 6-month-long part-time boot camps, evenings and weekends on college campuses. It's a very attractive financial model because they pay the college at the end of the 6 months and on a per-student basis. So converts real estate from a fixed cost into a variable cost. So those students are mostly people who have jobs and often families who can't take 3 months off for an intensive. It's a somewhat different population. We now have an investment in a company called Kenzie Academy that is one of a number of companies that is taking technology skills to yet another population. 40% of their students come from the food service and retail industries, which I think is pretty remarkable. Most of their students don't have college degrees, so they are really taking the most vulnerable people in society and lifting them up. Now, Trilogy and General Assembly also have stories like that, and they tried various experiments with colleges and with K-12 institutions at GA, but the models are built in different ways for different populations at their essence. We are now most excited about going beyond technology skills. So we have a fantastic company called SV Academy. Unfortunately, we own, as yet, a very small stake in it that is entirely free to the students and trains people to sell enterprise software. Free to the student, it lifts their salary up by roughly a factor of 2x, and they're diversifying the employee base of tech companies. We are interested in going beyond knowledge work to middle skills. And some other time I'll tell you about the welding company that we just regretfully turned down. But
Are you going to also tell us about Trilogy, or?
I can.
So I wanted to give you the full picture
Yeah.
of impact theses.
These panelists are very good at answering the question they want to answer as opposed to the question that you answer.
So with workforce training programs in general, you have a limited number of metrics. One of the interesting things about this, they're much easier metrics ultimately to gather than metrics in K-12. It's much easier to run in RCT. What is the salary of this person coming in? How selective is the program? What are the completion rates for the program? What are the salaries upon exit? What are the job placement rates? And then ideally, what are the salaries 2 years later?
Yeah.
What are the job satisfaction? Do people feel passionate about the new jobs that they've created? What is the human dimension?
And Vivian, is that the way Chan Zuckerberg measured it as well, or how did you?
Yeah, I mean, I think in answer to your question, which was kind of what was it about the impact that actually also contributed to its value as a business? I think one of the things was, in the bootcamp space, a lot of these bootcamps have had to build their own brands. In this case, Trilogy was taking the approach of leveraging universities' brands, existing brands. So they were partnered with over 40 universities, including Harvard and Berkeley and Georgetown and others, which gave the individual taking the courses a powerful certificate at the end of the 6-month program. And then the other piece of it that I really liked is ultimately what drove success for them was outcomes and placement, which meant that they really needed to focus on career services and helping the students actually find these jobs. It meant that they had to develop and design the curriculum such that it was responsive to the employer's needs, which meant that it was a valuable 6-month boot camp for the individuals. And so, and then the third piece I think that Trilogy really excels in is really kind of taking the data and really making sure that there's constant iteration around what's actually working and what pieces of the curriculum actually needed to be revamped on a regular basis. They also measured the student satisfaction on I think it's on a weekly basis, which was actually something that a nightly basis, which was actually very important for the universities to understand because the universities were lending their brand to this program. So you had a number of dimensions that kind of ensured the integrity of the process. And so for me, that was actually was very powerful that ultimately the impact was going to be aligned with what the business objectives were, which allowed them to be successful.
Speaking of announcements this week, the RISE Fund was happy to announce the launch of a new company called InStride, which is built in partnership with Arizona State University. It's leveraging ASU's success in their part of their college achievement plan, which is a partnership with Starbucks, and taking that kind of accredited university content and bringing it to working adults in other corporations. That's an opportunity that we only found because our impact strategy led us to a thesis that there was a gap in the market. You had high quality educational content provided by universities, but that was somewhat expensively and inflexibly delivered and wasn't reaching working adults. So when we met with the ASU team, actually at this conference a couple of years ago, their thesis really resonated with us. And we were only able to get into the opportunity because we were a social impact fund. A university wasn't interested in working with a different kind of fund than that because they wanted a mission-aligned group. Our impact underwriting suggests that because of the power of these university degrees and because they're affordably delivered, we expect that for every dollar of investment, there will be more than $12 of social impact that is generated for the students. And we've now recruited a terrific national caliber team, Vivek Sharma, who is the head of e-commerce at Disney, Josh Jarrett, who was formerly with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then Koru, Ann Keene, who was with Pearson, and some of them are in the audience. So if you're a university or a Fortune 1000 company, seek them out. Tory, you've had some really terrific exits.
Can I just tell an anecdote about InStride?
Yes.
Because I think there are too few anecdotes. This is sort of colorless, a lot of it. So at the Starbucks around the corner, a woman behind the counter looked at my badge and said, "What is ASU GSVX?" And we explained, and it turned out that all three of the women behind the counter were enrolled in ASU. One of them transferred from another university. The third one was very hesitant until she saw the positive experience that her countermates were having. You were talking about breadth versus depth. I think lean data and RCTs are one form of depth, but I think stories are a critical part of getting us out of bed in the morning and getting us to do the work we do.
20% of the folks who become employees at Starbucks now cite the College Achievement Plan as one of the reasons they joined. If those employees who participate in the program are twice as likely to still be employed a year later than those who are not, and they're 4 times as likely to have been promoted, and it doesn't even matter what major they chose. They don't have to study food service management, they could study psychology. It's really driving employee engagement. Is this a place I can learn? Is this a place I can advance my career? Is this an employer that cares about me? Okay, 30 seconds. Tory, you've had some fantastic exits. You both sold and also rolled into an ongoing ownership of Dreambox with us. You've had a nice exit with Accelerate Learning to Carlisle. tell us
Appreciate that.
about how impact and financial return go together or not in those,
In 9 seconds or less?
in 9 seconds, before these
No,
mics
no,
blow
no.
up.
Well, let's talk about Dreambox because that's the one you and I worked on together. I mean, it was core to the value of the asset, right? Like that business is valuable because it advances student learning faster than incumbent products. Full stop. It's not anything more than that, right? And so they were able to prove that with RCT data, and it attracted a universe of eager acquirers who felt that they could take that to the next level.
I think
John,
you
you
maybe
were the
get
man.
one more, because I don't know how many. we're now going up in
No,
time.
I'll say one sentence about Accelerate Learning, which is a digital science curriculum business that we helped grow out of Houston, Texas. Part of the reason that business was so successful in such a short period of time, approaching $100 million in bookings in less than 5 years, they built highly adaptive curriculum that could adapt to individual state standards. So it was not the usual case of a publisher imposing their perspective on states. It was highly adaptive, adjustable curriculum, and that's what the market needed. And in an internet world, you can do that massively less, or for massively less investment than you otherwise could in an analog world.
And just like the Academy
we're done.
Awards, the orchestra is now playing us off the stage. Thank you very much.